All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're peeling back the layers on the really sophisticated supply chain attack that hit Notepad+, a tool that, let's be honest, is a staple for so many of us. But we're not just going to talk about the problem. More importantly, we're going to walk through how to build a modern, layered defense to stop this kind of thing cold. This question right here, it's really the nightmare scenario of every supply chain attack. It's a story of betrayal. An app you trust, one you use every day, it's digitally signed, it looks totally legit. And suddenly, it's the weapon being used against you. It's how attackers weaponize the one thing you gave them for free, your trust. Let's see how they did it. So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll talk about how that trust in Notepad++ was broken. Then, we'll get into the nitty-gritty, the anatomy of the hijack itself. After we know what we're up against, we start building our defense, one layer at a time. Adaptive, then behavioral, and finally network defense. By the end, we'll put it all together into a solid blueprint you can actually use. Okay, so let's start with the real problem here. See, supply chain attacks aren't about brute force. They're not trying to kick down the front door. They're way sneakier. They find something you already trust, in this case, the official website and updater for Notepad++, and they poison the well. They turn that automatic trust we all have in software updates into the very path they use to get inside. And before we get too technical, let's just make sure we're all on the same page. What is a supply chain attack? Well, it's when the bad guys don't come after you directly. Instead, they find a weaker link in your digital chain, like one of your software vendors. They hack them, and then they use that vendor's legitimate update process to push their malware downstream. And that's how they get to you. This is where it gets really interesting. The attackers weaponize something we do all the time without a second thought, checking for a software update. They didn't even need a bug in Notepad++ itself. Nope, all they needed to do was take control of that little conversation between your app and the update server. Let's look at the timeline. And listen, this wasn't some quick hit. This campaign went on for 6 months. It all kicked off in June 2025 when they compromised the hosting server. For months, they were quietly redirecting some of that update traffic, sneaking their Chrysalis backdoor in through the real updater, gup. It took until December for anyone to catch on. 6 months. I mean, that is an eternity for an attacker to have the run of a network. So you can see just how methodical this was. Step 1, own the infrastructure. Step 2, hijack the updater. Send it to your own malicious server instead of the real one. Step 3, drop the payload, that Chrysalis backdoor. And finally, step 4, start looking around. They start with the basics, running simple commands like whoami and task list to figure out whose machine they just landed on. So what were the red flags? What were the breadcrumbs that this attack left behind? Well, the signs were there if you knew what to look for. First, the process behavior. The real updater, gup.exe, has no business ever launching a command prompt, cmd.exe. That's a huge red flag. Second, a rogue file called autoupdater.exe popped up in the temp folder. The real app doesn't use that. Third, network traffic. gup.exe started talking to weird, non-official IP addresses. That's your C2 right there. And finally, they used curl.exe to phone home with system info. These are the telltale signs. Okay, enough about the problem. Let's start building the solution. We're going to start with our first layer of defense, what we call adaptive protection. This is all about applying a zero-trust mindset, not just to people, but to your applications. It means you stop trusting an app just because of its name, and you start paying very close attention to what it actually does. Now, that zero-trust idea brings us to this really powerful concept, zero prevalence. So what in the world does that mean? It's simple, really. A zero prevalence behavior is any action from a trusted application that has literally never happened before in your environment. Think about all the things an application could do versus the small handful of things it normally does. That gap between could and does, that's a huge attack surface, and that's exactly where these behaviors live. And this is the perfect example right here. The absolute core of the Notepad++ attack, gup.exe launching cmd.exe, is a textbook zero prevalence behavior. In any normal, healthy setup, a text editor's updater has zero reason to open a command shell. It just doesn't happen. That action should stick out like a sore thumb. So how do we actually stop this? Well, the process is surprisingly simple. First, the adaptive protection engine sees gup.exe trying to launch cmd.exe and immediately flags it as zero prevalence behavior. Step 2, The security admin can use a feature like QuickTune to just say, you know what, block all of these weird, never-before-seen behaviors. One click. The result? The attack is stopped dead in its tracks, right at that very first step, even though it came from a totally trusted application. Now for our second layer. This one goes even deeper. We're talking about behavioral analysis, often powered by something called sonar. And this layer works on a very simple but incredibly powerful idea. It doesn't care what a file is. It could be signed, trusted, whatever. It only cares about what that file does after it's running. And right about now, you might be thinking, wait, isn't that just antivirus? And that is a great question, because it's fundamentally different. Traditional AV is all about signatures. It asks, what is this file? And checks it against a list of known bad guys. Behavioral analysis asks, what does this file do? It watches the sequence of actions in real time, and that's how it catches brand new malware and, more importantly, those tricky fileless attacks where a good process gets hijacked. It questions everybody. The real magic of sonar is in seeing the whole picture. Any single action might be fine on its own, but a specific chain of events, that's suspicious. For example, a process kicks off, but there's no window, no UI. Okay, weird. Then it tries to mess with protected system files, and then it tries to phone home to some random IP address. You see, individually, maybe okay, but all together, that's a malicious profile. Sonar sees that sequence, convicts it, and shuts the whole thing down before any damage is done. This brings us to our third and final defensive layer, the network itself. An intrusion prevention system, or IPS, is basically the super vigilant gatekeeper for all the traffic flowing in and out of your machine. So even if an attacker somehow gets past the first two layers, they still have to get through this one. An IPS is a real powerhouse. It's scanning everything that comes in and everything that goes out. It uses things like URL reputation to block connections to known malicious command and control servers before the connection even happens. Get this. A good IPS can stop over 70% of attacks right there at the network level before a malicious payload can even get a foothold on the endpoint. It's a massive choke point for attackers. So how would this have stopped the Notepad++ hijack? Easy. The IPS is the safety net that catches that command and control traffic. Remember, the Chrysalis backdoor needed to call home to get its instructions. Well, the IPS would see that outbound request from gup.exe going to some new, shady IP address. It would check its reputation list, see a big red flag, and just drop the connection. The malware is effectively stranded, cut off from its masters, and totally useless. So, we've walked through three powerful but very different layers of defense. Now it's time to put all the pieces together into a strategy that actually works. This is what your modern defense blueprint looks like. It's not about finding one single silver bullet, because that doesn't exist. It's about creating overlapping fields of fire. Let's just quickly recap. Our first layer, adaptive protection, stops that weird first step, like the updater trying to launch a command prompt. Think of it like locking all the doors inside your office that nobody ever needs to use. Layer 2, sonar, is like a behavioral profiler, watching for suspicious pattern of actions. And layer 3, the IPS, is the security guard at the main gate, checking every ID of everyone coming or going. When you put them all together, you get a real defense-in-depth strategy. Look, if you remember only one thing from our time today, please let it be this. Modern security is not about making a list of trusted apps. That whole model is broken. It's about building a system that trusts nothing, and instead constantly verifies the behavior of every process, every connection, every single time. Trust is a vulnerability. Verification is strength. And that really brings us to the final question you need to go back and ask about your own security. Is it built on a list of names, on what your software is? Or is it built on active, constant observation of what your software does? Because the answer to that question could be the difference between being safe and being the subject of the next security explainer. Thanks so much for joining me for this breakdown. If you want to go deeper on building out these kinds of layered defenses, please check out the resources on our website and our social channels. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay vigilant.